Thomas Blackwood arrived in the Bitterroot Mountains in 1978 with nothing but a canvas pack, a hunting rifle, and a determination to disappear from civilization that bordered on pathological. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat engineer, building bridges and water purification systems in jungle conditions, where failure meant dysentery could kill more men than enemy fire. The war had taught him that survival depended not on sophisticated equipment, but on understanding the fundamental principles that governed nature itself. When he returned to a country that felt more foreign than the rice paddies of Southeast Asia, he knew he could not stay. The mountains called to him with a voice that promised solitude, clarity, and the kind of honest struggle that made sense in ways civilian life never could. His first winter nearly killed him. The cabin he built from lodgepole pine logs was barely weatherproof when the November snows came early and deep. He had chosen a location near Willow Creek, a fast-moving stream that never froze completely even in the depths of winter, because water was life and he knew the creek would sustain him if nothing else did. But that first year, he learned the hard way that mountain water, despite its crystalline appearance, could harbor giardia and cryptosporidium that would leave a man doubled over with cramps and diarrhea that could prove fatal in isolation. Boiling water required fuel he could not always spare. Chemical tablets were a crutch he refused to depend on. He needed something better, something permanent. Something that would work without resupply or maintenance beyond what the land itself could provide. The answer came from a memory buried in his combat engineer training and refined through necessity and observation. He had seen village women in Vietnam filtering water through layers of sand and crushed charcoal, a technique so ancient it predated written history. The principle was simple. Mechanical filtration removed visible particles, activated carbon-absorbed chemicals and organic compounds, and successive layers of different-sized materials trapped progressively smaller contaminants. What the Army Corps of Engineers accomplished with pumps and chemical treatments, these women achieved with gravity and patience. Thomas spent that entire winter sketching designs, calculating flow rates, and studying the geology of his surroundings. By spring, he had a plan that married ancient wisdom with engineering precision in ways that would prove revolutionary decades later. He built his first filter system in the summer of 1979, using materials scavenged entirely from the landscape around him. The main housing came from a hollowed section of fire-scarred cedar, naturally resistant to rot and large enough to hold the filtration layers he envisioned. He spent weeks collecting stones from the creek bed, sorting them meticulously by size into categories that ranged from cobbles to fine gravel to coarse sand. The gradation was critical because water needed to pass through progressively finer materials, each layer capturing particles the previous one had missed. He hiked 15 miles to an old forest fire site where he could harvest partially burned wood, which he then subjected to a second, controlled burn in an oxygen-starved environment to create activated charcoal with a molecular structure riddled with microscopic pores that could trap organic compounds and heavy metals. The design incorporated 7 distinct layers, each serving a specific purpose in the purification process. The top layer consisted of coarse gravel that removed large debris and provided initial mechanical filtration. Below that, a thick bed of medium-grade sand caught smaller particles and provided biological filtration as beneficial bacteria colonized the surface, consuming organic matter and pathogens. The third layer was activated charcoal, crushed to a consistency that maximized surface area while maintaining adequate flow rate. Beneath the charcoal, fine sand provided another stage of mechanical filtration. A layer of crushed limestone added essential minerals while raising pH to counteract any acidity from the charcoal. Another charcoal layer handled any remaining organic compounds. The final layer was the finest sand he could sift, almost powder-like, which caught anything that had made it through the previous 6 barriers. Water entered the top of the system through a simple wooden trough that fed the creek flow into the gravel layer. Gravity did all the work, pulling the water downward through each successive layer at a rate slow enough to ensure thorough contact with the filtration media, but fast enough to provide adequate daily volume. The filtered water emerged from a clay pipe Thomas had fired himself, dripping into a stone collection basin he had carved from a single piece of granite. The entire system was housed in a wooden structure that protected it from weather and animals, while allowing airflow to prevent stagnation. It was elegant in its simplicity, powerful in its effectiveness, and entirely sustainable using only materials the mountain provided. That first glass of filtered water tasted clean and pure, free of the mineral harshness and biological threats that characterized untreated mountain streams. For 40 years, Thomas refined and expanded his system with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove to anyone. He built secondary filters for redundancy, experimented with different types of charcoal to improve chemical adsorption, and adjusted the thickness of each layer based on seasonal variations in water quality. He documented everything in a series of leather-bound journals, recording flow rates, filter performance, and the subtle changes in water chemistry he detected through taste and observation. His notations were precise and technical, filled with calculations and chemical formulas that revealed the educated mind behind the mountain man facade. He tested his water constantly, using simple field methods he had learned in the army and refined through experience: clarity tests, biological indicator tests, and careful observation of how different plants and animals responded to the water. The isolation suited him in ways that civilization never had. He spoke to no one for months at a time, marking the passage of seasons by the angle of sunlight and the behavior of wildlife rather than calendars or clocks. His only regular contact with the outside world came twice a year when he hiked to the small town of Connor to trade furs and medicinal herbs for salt, ammunition, and the occasional book. The townspeople knew him as the Hermit of Willow Creek, a ghost story parents used to scare children away from wandering too deep into the wilderness. They whispered that he was crazy, that he had been broken by the war, that he talked to trees and trusted water filtered through dirt more than the municipal system that served the valley. They were right about all of it, but they failed to understand that his madness was more functional than their sanity. His reputation as an eccentric recluse protected him from the one thing he feared most: unwanted company. Occasionally, hunters or hikers would stumble upon his cabin, and he would watch them from concealment until they moved on, never revealing himself unless absolutely necessary. Twice, search and rescue teams looking for lost hikers had approached his property, and both times he had ghosted them so effectively, they later reported the cabin appeared abandoned. He did not want to be found, did not want to be saved, did not want to be brought back into a world that felt increasingly incomprehensible with each passing year. The mountain was his monastery, silence his prayer, and the water filter his sacrament, a daily reminder that life could be sustained through knowledge, discipline, and respect for natural processes. The chemical spill that would validate his entire life's work began on a rainy October morning in 2019, when a tanker truck carrying industrial solvents jackknifed on Highway 93, rupturing its containment tanks and spilling 8,000 gallons of mixed chemical waste into the Clark Fork River. The chemicals included trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, and a proprietary blend of fluorinated compounds used in aerospace manufacturing, substances so stable and persistent they could contaminate water supplies for decades. Within hours, the spill had reached the Bitterroot River system, spreading a toxic plume that affected 7 counties and endangered the water supply for over 50,000 people. State and federal agencies responded with emergency protocols, trucking in bottled water and deploying mobile reverse osmosis units, while scientists worked to characterize the contamination and develop remediation strategies. The problem revealed itself within days. The modern filtration systems were not working effectively. Reverse osmosis units could remove the chlorinated solvents, but were ineffective against the fluorinated compounds, which had molecular structures small and stable enough to pass through the membranes. Activated carbon filters worked better, but required such frequent replacement that the cost became prohibitive. Distillation removed everything, but required enormous amounts of energy. As weeks stretched into months, the affected communities remained dependent on bottled water, trucked in from distant sources, a logistical nightmare that could not be sustained indefinitely. Scientists from the EPA and multiple universities struggled to develop a solution, testing dozens of advanced filtration technologies with limited success. The chemicals that modern industry had created proved resistant to modern remediation techniques. A bitter irony that highlighted the unintended consequences of technological progress. Thomas learned of the crisis during his autumn trip to Connor, where the town square had been converted into a bottled water distribution center, and people stood in lines that stretched around the block. He listened to conversations in the trading post, piecing together the scope of the disaster from fragments of worried dialogue and official announcements posted on community bulletin boards. His creek originated above the contamination zone, fed by springs and snowmelt that had not been affected by the spill, but he understood the implications for everyone downstream. That night, back in his cabin, he tested his filtered water using every method he knew, looking for any sign that the chemicals had somehow reached his system despite the geographic isolation. The water remained pure, as clean as it had been for 40 years. He might have left it at that, secure in his isolation, while the valley below struggled with their crisis. But something stirred in him that he had not felt since Vietnam, a sense that his knowledge could help people in ways that transcended his desire for solitude. He thought of the children in town who were drinking water from plastic bottles, of the elderly and sick who were vulnerable to any lapse in the supply chain, of the families who could not afford to keep buying water indefinitely. He thought of his own youth, when he had built water systems in jungle villages because it was the right thing to do, because soldiers were supposed to protect people even when it meant personal sacrifice. The man he had been 40 years ago would not have hesitated. The question was whether the man he had become still had that capacity for connection and service. The decision came gradually, like dawn light filtering through forest canopy. He spent 2 weeks preparing, gathering samples of his filter media, documenting his system with detailed sketches and notes, and rehearsing the words he would need to say to convince people to listen. He knew how he would appear to them, a wild-eyed hermit emerging from the woods with claims that sand and charcoal could solve what advanced technology could not. They would dismiss him as delusional, another casualty of isolation and conspiracy theories. He would need proof, evidence that could not be explained away or attributed to luck. On a cold November morning, he filled a dozen mason jars with filtered water and packed them carefully alongside his documentation. Then he locked his cabin, shouldered his pack, and began the long hike to town, knowing that this journey would change everything regardless of whether anyone believed him. The County Emergency Operations Center had been established in the high school gymnasium, a chaotic space filled with folding tables, whiteboards covered in technical diagrams, and exhausted officials who had been working 18-hour days for over a month. Thomas arrived unannounced, looking exactly like what he was. A man who had lived alone in the wilderness for 4 decades, with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail, weathered skin, and eyes that seemed to look past surfaces into deeper truths. The security guard tried to turn him away until Thomas mentioned water filtration, at which point a harried assistant director agreed to give him 5 minutes. Those 5 minutes turned into an hour as Thomas laid out his system with the precision of the engineer he had been, explaining the layered approach, the importance of gradation, and the specific properties of different types of activated carbon. He presented his water samples and his documentation, and he answered every technical question they asked with detailed knowledge that belied his appearance. The scientists were skeptical but desperate enough to investigate. They took his water samples for testing, expecting to find either contamination or some lucky geographic isolation that protected his source water. What they found instead changed the trajectory of the entire remediation effort. Thomas's filtered water was not just clean, it was purer than anything they had been able to produce with modern systems. The fluorinated compounds that had defeated reverse osmosis were completely absent. The chlorinated solvents were below detection limits. Even trace metals and naturally occurring contaminants had been removed to levels that exceeded EPA standards. The head chemist ran the tests 3 times, certain there had been a mistake, before accepting the impossible result. A water filter built from rocks, sand, and burned wood was outperforming technology that cost millions of dollars and required constant maintenance and energy input. The first instinct was to dismiss it as unreplicable, a fluke that could not be scaled or standardized. Thomas returned to his cabin with a team of engineers and hydrologists who documented every aspect of his system, measuring layer thickness, analyzing the particle size distribution of his sand and gravel, and testing the adsorption capacity of his charcoal. They discovered a sophistication in the design that contradicted its primitive appearance. The gradation of materials was optimal for both mechanical and biological filtration. The charcoal had a pore structure that was actually superior to commercially produced activated carbon because the slower, lower-temperature burning process created a more consistent distribution of micropores ideal for trapping the specific compounds in the spill. The limestone layer provided buffering that prevented the pH from dropping too low while contributing beneficial minerals. Most importantly, the system operated as an integrated whole, with each layer supporting the others in ways that industrial filtration systems, designed to maximize single variable performance, did not achieve. Within weeks, the county had constructed prototype filters based on Thomas's design at 3 locations, using locally sourced materials processed according to his specifications. The results were immediate and dramatic. Contaminated water passed through the system and emerged clean enough to drink, with removal rates for the problematic fluorinated compounds exceeding 98%. The cost per gallon of treated water was a fraction of what the reverse osmosis units required, and the only ongoing expense was periodic replacement of the charcoal layer, which could be produced locally using waste wood from forest management operations. More prototypes followed, scaled up to serve entire neighborhoods. By Christmas, over 20,000 people had their tap water restored, no longer dependent on bottled water or emergency supplies. The technology that everyone had dismissed as primitive was solving a crisis that advanced systems could not address. The story reached national media in January, carried by reporters who saw it as a feel-good tale about ingenuity and self-reliance. The coverage made Thomas deeply uncomfortable, but he tolerated it because it amplified the message he thought was important: that modern society had become so enamored with complexity and technology that it had forgotten fundamental principles that had sustained human civilization for millennia. He gave interviews in his cabin, surrounded by his filtration systems and journals, explaining that he had not invented anything but simply remembered and refined techniques that predated modern chemistry. The ancient Romans had used sand and gravel filters for their aqueducts. Japanese villagers had been making activated carbon for water purification for over 1,000 years. Indigenous peoples on every continent had developed methods for cleaning water using natural materials. His contribution was not discovery, but translation, taking old knowledge and applying engineering principles to optimize performance. The academic and industrial responses were mixed. Some scientists embraced the findings, recognizing that bio-inspired and traditional technologies often contained solutions that high-tech approaches overlooked. Others resisted, arguing that the success was specific to this particular contaminant profile and could not be generalized. Chemical companies and filtration manufacturers downplayed the significance, noting correctly that Thomas's system required more space and time than compact commercial units, making it impractical for many applications. But the undeniable fact remained: when it mattered most, when lives and communities depended on clean water, the simple system built by a hermit in the mountains had worked when everything else had failed. That reality could not be explained away or dismissed, no matter how uncomfortable it made people who had built careers on technological sophistication. Universities requested his journals for analysis and preservation. The Library of Congress wanted them for their permanent collection, recognizing them as documents of historical and scientific significance. Thomas refused them all, stating that the knowledge belonged to anyone who needed it and should not be locked away in institutions. Instead, he worked with a small environmental nonprofit to publish a detailed manual explaining how to construct and maintain his filtration system using only locally available materials. The manual was released as a free download, translated into 30 languages, and distributed to communities in developing countries where access to clean water remained a daily struggle. Within a year, variations of Thomas's design were operating in refugee camps, rural villages, and disaster zones around the world, providing clean water to hundreds of thousands of people with no need for electricity, chemical inputs, or complex maintenance. The attention fundamentally changed his life in ways he had not anticipated. His isolation was broken, not by force but by a steady stream of visitors who came seeking knowledge. Graduate students writing dissertations, engineers developing humanitarian projects, and ordinary people who wanted to learn self-sufficient living skills. He found himself becoming a reluctant teacher, sharing not just the technical details of water filtration, but the broader philosophy that had guided his 4 decades in the wilderness. He taught that true sustainability was not about buying expensive green technologies, but about understanding natural processes deeply enough to work with them rather than against them. He explained that the goal was not to return to some imagined primitive past, but to integrate timeless principles with modern knowledge in ways that were resilient, accessible, and appropriate to local conditions. His relationship with the nearby town evolved from distant tolerance to something approaching respect. The people who had once called him crazy now saw him as a resource, someone whose knowledge had proven valuable when everything familiar had failed. They invited him to speak at the high school about water science and wilderness survival. They asked for his input on sustainable development projects and emergency preparedness planning. He remained uncomfortable with social interaction, still preferred his solitary cabin, and never stayed in town longer than necessary. But he no longer avoided people with quite the same determination. He had learned what many hermits eventually discovered, that complete isolation was ultimately a luxury, and knowledge that was not shared died with the person who held it. The chemical company responsible for the spill eventually reached a settlement with the affected communities, paying for permanent filtration systems based on Thomas's design to be installed at multiple locations throughout the watershed. The systems were built larger and more sophisticated than his original cabin filter, incorporating modern materials where appropriate while maintaining the fundamental principles that made them effective. Each installation included a plaque acknowledging Thomas Blackwood's contribution, a gesture he found both embarrassing and appropriate. The settlement also funded research into natural filtration systems, establishing a program at the State University that investigated how traditional and indigenous water treatment methods could be validated, improved, and applied to contemporary challenges. Thomas served as an unpaid consultant, reviewing research proposals and occasionally hosting graduate students at his cabin for intensive field courses in practical water science. The epilogue to the crisis came 3 years later, when the EPA published a comprehensive study of the remediation effort that compared the performance and cost-effectiveness of different treatment technologies. Thomas's biofiltration system, now refined and standardized through scientific study, had emerged as the most successful approach for this particular type of contamination. The report noted that while the system could not replace modern municipal water treatment for all purposes, it represented a valuable tool for specific applications, particularly in resource-limited settings or for removing persistent organic pollutants that challenged conventional methods. The conclusion was carefully worded, acknowledging the value of traditional approaches while maintaining that modern technology still had its place, but the implications were clear. Sometimes the oldest solutions were indeed the most effective. Thomas did not read the EPA report, though copies were sent to him by multiple people. He knew what he knew, and government validation changed nothing about the fundamental truth he had spent 40 years proving: that water could be cleaned using rocks, sand, charcoal, and gravity if you understood the principles deeply enough. What mattered to him was that children were drinking clean water, that families had been spared a public health disaster, and that maybe, just maybe, a few people had learned to question the assumption that newer was always better. He remained in his cabin, tending his filters and his isolation, though both were more permeable now than they had been before the spill. The mountains still gave him what he needed, and his water still tasted pure and cold, filtered through layers of stone and time and knowledge that had proven more resilient than any human institution. On quiet evenings, he sometimes sat on his porch and watched the creek that had sustained him for so long, thinking about the strange path that had brought him from the jungles of Vietnam to these mountains, from combat engineer to hermit to accidental savior of a poisoned watershed. He had not sought recognition or redemption, had not wanted anything except to be left alone with his work and his silence. Yet here he was, his name in newspapers and scientific journals, his design being replicated across continents, his primitive system saving lives in ways his military service never had. There was irony in that, and perhaps justice too, the universe's way of insisting that some knowledge was too important to remain hidden no matter how much the holder valued privacy. The water continued to flow, as it always had, tumbling down from high country snowfields through his 7-layer filter and into the stone basin where he filled his cup each morning. The taste was unchanged, pure and mineral clean. A daily reminder that some things worked simply because they were true, because they aligned with natural law in ways that required no theory to validate and no technology to improve. He had spent 40 years learning that lesson, and another 3 years teaching it to a world that had briefly paid attention before moving on to newer crises and fresher stories. But the filters remained, operating silently and effectively, and the water kept running clean, and that was enough. That had always been enough. The mountain held him still, as it had since 1978, and he remained content with that holding, with the solitude that was less complete but no less essential, with the knowledge that his strange life had produced something of lasting value, even if he had never intended it. Thomas Blackwood would eventually die in that cabin. Years or decades in the future, and someone would find his journals and his filters and his legacy of proving that wisdom sometimes wore the disguise of madness, that the most revolutionary ideas could emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that a man who wanted nothing from the world could still give it something precious. Until then, he continued his work, refining his systems, documenting his findings, and occasionally teaching those rare visitors humble enough to learn from someone who lived deliberately outside the boundaries they took for granted. The creek kept flowing, the filters kept working, and the water remained pure. Everything else was commentary, the noise of a world that misunderstood silence as emptiness rather than recognizing it as the space where truth could be heard most clearly. Thomas understood this as he had understood water, instinctively and completely, and that understanding sustained him through the fame he had never wanted and the attention he could not entirely avoid. He was still the hermit of Willow Creek, still the man who talked to trees and trusted dirt more than technology. But now the world had learned what the mountain had known all along, that his madness was wisdom, that his primitive system was sophisticated, and that sometimes the best way forward required remembering the paths that had been walked before, improved not through replacement, but through deeper understanding and thoughtful application of eternal principles. The story could have ended a dozen different ways, but it ended here, with water flowing through stone and sand and charcoal, emerging clean and cold and true, with a man who had wanted only to be left alone discovering that his knowledge mattered, that his work had meaning, and that even hermits could not entirely escape the web of human connection. The filter he built outlasted him, replicated thousands of times, saving millions of gallons of water and uncounted lives. A monument more enduring than marble because it was built from the land itself and returned to the land what it had borrowed, completing a cycle that honored both the past and future. Thomas Blackwood became a name associated with innovation and wisdom, though he remained fundamentally unchanged by that association, still preferring the company of silence to the noise of recognition, still trusting his own hands and eyes more than any technology or credential. The mountain keeps its secrets still, but this one it shared, because some knowledge is too important to remain hidden, because clean water is life itself, and because sometimes the most important thing a person can do is remember what everyone else has forgotten and prove through stubborn example that simple does not mean simplistic, that old does not mean obsolete, and that the best solutions to modern problems may lie not in innovation, but in the patient refinement of wisdom that has sustained humanity since the first person discovered they could clean water by passing it through sand. That was Thomas Blackwood's legacy, built from stone and charcoal, and 4 decades of deliberate solitude, a gift given reluctantly, but received gratefully by a world that had briefly stopped dismissing those who lived differently and learned instead to ask what they knew that everyone else had forgot.